Welcome, everybody. I know we have some folks watching on YouTube and some folks that are joining us on Zoom. We'll be getting started in just a few moments. If you are watching on Zoom, please take a moment to fill out the poll that has popped up on your screen. That helps us understand how many people are joining us from each household so that we can get a better idea of how many people are watching. And another minute. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. All right, folks, we are at 7 p.m., so we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Annie Tillman. I am the Adult Program Coordinator here at the Schaumburg Library. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Tonight, we have the world's first science fiction novel, Frankenstein, which was written by 19-year-old Mary Shelley. The story of how she came to write such a novel reveals the painful struggle of a brilliant and rebellious mind. Born of two idealistic parents, Mary turned her back on 19th century English social norms to have a relationship with romantic poet Percy Bysshe Shelley. Come and be enchanted by a national touring actress and award-winning storyteller Megan Wells as she tells Mary Shelley's true story of that dark and stormy night. If you have any questions, please feel free to put those in the chat and the Q&A. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Mary Shelley.
Good evening. I'm so happy to be here with you. If you'll just give me one moment to finish my thoughts. I do make my way by writing. It is a rare thing in my day for a woman to make her way by her writing. You will be familiar, of course, with one of my novels, Frankenstein. That is the story I believe you have come to hear about, but it is a long journey to get there. In my day, I was often asked how it is that a 19-year-old girl could write such a thing. And in your day, I imagine you ask the same. How is it that a 19-year-old girl could write such a thing? But the tone and the emphasis in the phrase is completely different. In my day, the question was asked, how is it that a 19-year-old girl could write such a thing? A girl writing, a woman writing, and such a thing. But you see, there was nothing else to be done. Nothing else to be done. That story was born in the beginning and birthed itself in 1816. My mother and my father are at the center of it all. If we were in my father's study, we would look up right here. There would be a portrait of my mother, a large portrait of my mother, Mary Wollstonecraft. Mary Wollstonecraft was the original equalist. In your day, I believe you refer to it as feminist, but for my mother, it was equality she was most interested in. My mother's life was hard. And this story is not of fairies and sunshine over rivers. It is a dark river, the River Fleet, where we begin this tale. But we are in the season of October, so I think you will be well suited to the darkness and the shadows of my life. My mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, was born just at the top of the bottom, where a whole new society of men was attempting to crawl themselves out from the poverty that defined our England. There were two states of people. There were those who had everything and those who had nothing, and those who had nothing usually served those who had everything. Except now there were new factories and men were becoming bosses. My grandfather was such a man. He began a glove factory that emptied its tannings and its chemicals into that River Fleet, and he, pulling himself up from poverty, had one good friend: the bottle. Grandfather liked to drink. My grandfather liked to drink and then come home from his office, and he would take out his drinking moods upon his wife. That is what women were for, after all. And so my mother and her sisters and her brother would listen to the horror downstairs. As soon as my mother was able, at 15 years old, she left her mother. And she had to leave her sisters behind. And she promised that she would come back for them or send money for them. And she went out into the world. Now, what were her options as a woman? My mother's options there in 1770. She could be a teacher or a governess. She could take care of other women's daughters and children, or she could marry, and marriage was not on my mother's mind, watching her father and hers. She became a governess. Now, fortune had it that the woman who hired my mother to be a governess loved books and allowed my mother to read them. And my mother, who had done a little bit of reading, just scraping by on her own, finally was able to pour herself into her deepest passion. Words. Yes, mother. We share a passion for words. Well, she did an unheard of thing. She opened up a journal, my mother, and she began to write down her thoughts. Yes, she had thoughts. She had whole thoughts. And not only did she write down her thoughts, she wrote down the atmosphere and the mood of the day and all the beauty that was around her when she was having these thoughts, which then led her to open up her feelings. She would write her feelings down. And in that trinity of thought and place and feeling, my mother invented a whole new branch of literature. You call it the Romantic era. It was my mother who got that started. Well, Once she finished her position as governess, she took what money she had to get her sisters situated as best she could into teaching positions, and her one sister was married off and wrote her letters about it. That wedding and marriage did not go any better than my grandfather and grandmother. And so my mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, there will be many Marys in this tale. My mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, went to rescue her sister from marriage because her husband had decided he did not like this wife very much, and it was on his mind to be rid of her. Now, it was perfectly legal to be rid of a wife in many ways, the most convenient being the insane asylum. He was simply going to declare her mad, deposit her in the insane asylum, and then the child born to the two of them, which was the cause of his displeasure with her, because she was taking care of the child and not so much him. That child, of course, it was his right to simply give that child to a somewhat drunk or dry witness, so that child would not thrive. That child would simply die on its own, and then he could go get himself a new wife and start it all over again. My mother saw nothing good in marriage for any woman. A woman lost all her property, all her name, all her powers, all her rights, all her thoughts. What was she? My mother stole that sister quietly in the night, put her in a carriage. They left the child behind because they had to, or she would have been arrested, put in jail. Even your children were your husband's property. I tell you this dark story to get you used to it right here up front, but also because it is the underpinnings of all that my life was built on. My mother poured out all these experiences, all these understandings of marriage, and she dared to write a book on the vindication of the rights of women. This was the very first writing down of the thoughts of what it would be. What would the world be? What would children be? Wouldn't everything be better if they were equal? And she dared to take that into a publisher's office, plop it down, and he, for some strange reason, decided to read it. He read it. He thought it'd be interesting conversation in the literary salons of London. And so he published that pamphlet and sent it out. And do you know what? It was very interesting. It was very talked of. It was not considered a reasonable thing to do, but it was a very interesting conversation. And so the publisher eventually invited my mother into the literary science and said, "This is Mary Wollstonecraft, who has written such a thing." And slowly my mother's other writings, her more romantic writings, began to spread about that literary society. My mother became the famous Mary Wollstonecraft and dared to wear pants so she might be able to move around more easily. And this is where my world begins. At those literary salons was another famous writer, William Godwin. These two could not have been more opposite, like sun and moon. William Godwin, my father, was a Calvinist. That means, do you know? It means he did not believe in smiling. No, William Godwin did not believe in smiling at all. No, what William Godwin believed in is perfect thoughts, perfectly crafted, and it would sometimes take him a full week to write one sentence. I know I grew up at his feet, but we will come to that. William Godwin, the Calvinist, with no dancing, no smiling, no joy, nothing but perfect thought, wrote a book. two famous books, my mother's Mary Wollstonecraft on the Vindication for the Rights of Women, and my father's big book, Political Justice. Oh, you ought to know that book, Political Justice. That book shaped the revolutions in the world. The French Revolution went out from there. The Irish revolts out from the Political Justice. That book was even carried over by ship to your America, and it was read by the founders of your democracy. Political Justice. Now, because my father had written such a book, he was paid by the publishers for the writing of it, and people would come to sit and learn from him for his great Calvinist political thoughts, and they would give him money for such a thing. So he would have salons and publishing, and that is the way my father made his way into the world. There they are. I have caught you up. Mary Wollstonecraft with her wild curls and hair, and William Godwin on the other side of the table at the literary salons, agape and aghast, but daring not to show it on his face. He hated my mother until he fell in love with her. She was the largest being he had ever met. So both of them, in all of their writings, had disdained marriage, were against it completely. A terrible institution. What did it offer a woman? But there they were, madly and wildly in love. And my mother came to that union already with a child. My half-sister Fanny was born with one of your Americans. Gilbert Imlay had come over to the French Revolution because he could smuggle goods from France all the way up into Northern Europe to the Scandinavian countries and was making himself quite a bit of money at that smuggling. Well, he took my mother into his bed and got her with child and then decided he wasn't interested. Sir William Godwin and Mary Wollstonecraft got themselves with child and married against all their public philosophies. My mother's portrait was painted when she was full with me, and that is the portrait that hung over my father's table. I can see it in my mind's eye. You can actually look it up, but you won't need to because I can describe it to you. Her soft curls covering around her face, shaped like a halo of light. Her face is soft and round as a woman's face will glow when full with a loving child. And there is the softest of French lace about her shoulders that meets here, and the portrait finishes just below, and she looks with loving eyes, with optimism and brilliance out into the world. August 29th, a comet flew over the London sky, and my mother and my father held hands and looked up at that comet and thought it a good omen. The next day, my mother went into labor with me, but it did not progress properly. It was an untidy and painful birthing, and the afterbirth did not come as naturally it should come, and so a doctor needed to be sent for. Now, you must understand, you cannot just simply ring up the doctor. You must see this in your mind's eye. The servants waiting outside the delivery door there with William Godwin pacing in such fear, and the news comes in from the servant who is caring for my mother and her best friend Maria Revelry. We must need the doctor. The afterbirth isn't coming. Well, then down the stairs, all the way down, because the bedrooms are always on the upper floors. And then you call out to the street to find a young serving boy. And if you get a good serving boy, you give him a coin. And if he's a good boy, he will go to the doctor's. If he is a bad boy, then he will go in the other direction. Well, in this case, he went to the doctor's. Now, there are the doctors. You have to ring the doctor up, of course, which means that the servant has to ask you to wait in the hall while the doctor finishes his brandy and his smoke after his dinner. When the doctor is done with his brandy and his smoke, he will come on down and decide that William Godwin and Mary Wollstonecraft have a good reputation. Well, he just might do it. How much time has passed? And can you see the doctor finally arriving and attending to my mother's afterbirth? With no ether or anything to dull her pain. And then, of course, when he was finished, he called for the servants to bring a brass bowl to, wash his hands, a nice washing bowl. You saved your brass for the doctors. Then he washed his hands. Afterwards, in my world, we did not understand yet what a doctor's hands had on them and brought to them. 1 out of every 2 baby was dying as the mothers were taken up with what they call the childbed fever, the puerperal fever. And so after a blissful 3 days of my father and my mother and I, there nestled between the sun and the moon that would shape my whole being, all the guests arrived to see the child of William and Mary, the child of William, sitting downstairs in the great salon, the women tittering together because they could hear that Mary must have given a good birth because she's already rearranging the furniture. My mother was not rearranging the furniture. No, my mother's fever was so intense. She was trembling and shaking with such a high fever that it was literally moving the bed across the bedroom floor. I had my mother for 10 days in the flesh, and I was too young to know it. After that, I was raised by my mother's portrait. My father's grief was profound, and my mother's friend Maria Revelry took me into her care, provided wet nursing for me, took care of Fanny and I, and that is how we were raised in that very quiet house. My father, a Calvinist again, in his study with the door closed, writing slowly his perfect sentences and trying to decide what to do with all of my mother's flowery romantic writings. Shall he hide them or let them go out into the world? At 1 o'clock, we were always ready outside his door, Fanny and I, dressed by Maria, and he would open the study door and I would see my mother's face and greet her in my mind. And he would take us then out from the house. Now, this is another picture for you. It is another new invention. Just 3 miles north of London, the outleap of houses, the polygons of Somers Town, a very first suburb. Ours was 29 polygon, and out we would go to all the beautiful homes and walk around the Central Park and pass by the shops. And there would be the milliner and the haberdashery and the candy shops and the watchmakers. And they were all French revolutionists, and they would call out, bonjour, bonjour. And we would wave our little hands, and then we would hear him in the distance, the mayor of Gario, Do you know the Muffin Man, the Muffin Man, the Muffin Man? Do you know the Muffin Man that lives in Drury Lane? The little tinkling of his muffin cart. Yes, I know the Muffin Man. Come, Fanny, come. And we would run to the Muffin Man, and those muffins would still be warm, and Father would procure for us a little syllabub, which is whipped cream that has gone warm. This is the taste of the height of happiness, which did not long last. Father would bring us home and put us to our studies. He invited a doctor to measure my head to see if I did inherit both his and mother's brain. Slowly, Fanny and I were separated out from each other as I was educated by my father, there at his knee in his study, watching him with his perfect sentences and looking at my mother, looking over at him and at me. And then my story becomes Cinderella. A woman moved next door. Mary Jane Clairmont. As I said, there were a lot of Marys in this story. Mary Jane Clairmont was a pretend widow, and I must not falter and be so hard upon her because she was very, very clever and very, very smart. She had, in fact, translated Swiss Family Robinson so that it might go out and become the preeminent English translation for a full century. She had done so to get out of debtor's prison. Oh, yes, that's right. A woman couldn't have any debt, could she? She had survived debtor's prison with her daughter and her son, each by different men, French soldiers that had lost their blood into Flanders fields. She moved into the polygon right next to us. She learned very quickly who it was that lived next door. She went out and she read Political Justice. I think she must have read it a good 5 or 6 times. She knew it backwards and forwards. And then she watched my Calvinist father and all his habits and knew the exact moments that he would come out from the upper balcony after dinner to have his cigar. Well, she went out on a beautiful night and she arranged herself so she might appear to be dessert. And she called up to him, "Is that the most eminent, immortal William Godwin?" She called up to him at the balcony. My father had been in his widowhood now for a good year and more. And he looked down at dessert. "It is, mademoiselle." "Oh, you great being, how I adore you," said she. There's the hook set and pulled. Well, my father, whose every single writing detested the state of marriage, now married twice. Well, he had to marry Mary Jane Clairmont because now she was going to have his child. And so second mama brought my new half-brother and my new half-sister into our house at the Polygon. And up the stairs, little Jane ran straight into my bed, plopped herself upon it and said, "This shall be my room." "Oh, no, it won't." We were 3, 4, 5, and 6, 6, 5, 4, and 3. 3, 4, 5, and 6, 6, 5, 4, and 3. These were the numbers I went over and over and over and over and over in my head because it was the only good thought I could have. Oh, I did not like second mama. Father wanted me to call her mother and I could not do it. She was neat and tidy. She made us nice, neat clothes. The bedclothes were always clean. The house was clean. Any waste was immediately resolved. And she began to erupt into my father's study right in the middle of his perfect sentences and says, "Can't you get something published, William? We need more money." Oh, People weren't buying political justice anymore. She's like, can't you write something for children? I think children's books might be a good way for us to make some money. My Calvinist father attempting to write books for children. Lucky for him, my mother had left him a few pieces. Well, we couldn't afford it. And so she moved us right out. Fanny and Charles and Jane and Mary left the Polygon. I was just at the age of remembering. It was a horrid place. 41 Skinner Street. We had moved from the beautiful Polygon. We had moved from the trees and the heath outside and the clean River Fleet. And now we were right in the heart of it at Newgate Market, right around the corner of Newgate Prison. Oh, this 5-story ramshackle horror. Second mother arranged for there to be a bookstore on the bottom floor so that we might make some coin. She was very, very clever with the coin. She devoted a whole section to children's books and began to have authors coming in who were interested in the children's book, and she had a whole section of ghost stories. Oh, gee, I wonder if we can imagine where little Mary was in the ghost story section, reading Bluebeard and Mr. Fox over and over and over again. There are 3 poets in my life. The first, Uncle Sam. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, you may have heard of him. The Rime of the Ancient Mariner was a friend of my father's. Not an uncle by blood, but an uncle by heart. He would come over and he would play with us. He taught us how to slide down the barrister, the banister, the banister, the barrister. You must be careful what you say or the lawyer will make you pay. We loved him dearly. He would read his poems out loud to us. I will never forget sneaking down to the salon when he was reading that Ancient Mariner right after he had first written it, and the fire was lit in the fireplace and everyone was gathered round, bent to listen, and we snuck into it. Fanny would not go and Charles did not care, and so I took little Jane. We snuck into it and we sat behind the settee. And the fireplace crackled as he recited his poem with his curly hair and his dimples and his hands held high. And those flames from that fireplace threw his shadows tall, like so, here upon the walls. Poet and words and light and fire and shadow, all these things my soul drank deep. Of course, second mama found us there and she hied us off to bed and we were punished for it. Whenever there was a hanging, we would be on the 5th floor of the nursery where we did our studies, and we would look out the window as much of London would come down that Newgate Street, go round the corner as the bells of St. Sepulchre rang. Such hunger for a hanging. And then second mother would take us with her to do the shopping at Newgate Market, right through the carcasses, with the meat hanging, you know, not fully drained, until its blood would drip there into the street. And I remember Fanny and Jane and I and Charles always skipping a leg, seemed to be seemed to be loving the red puddles splashing about him. And Fanny and I would just sing to ourselves, do you know the Muffin Man, the Muffin Man, the Muffin Man, oh, do you know the Muffin Man? My mind was too young for such things. My mind was too raw for such things. My mind was full of words. I read everything that my mother wrote. I read all her opinions of marriage. I read what she thought about the equality of women. And then I buried myself again in Bluebeard and Mr. Fox. And I read my father's works too on political justice and the understanding of what freedom is and liberation and how to sleep. It was near impossible. This memory. I began to itch. Great flakes, as if I were my own ghost, my skin snowing off of me. You call it eczema. Second mother called it awful. Oh, take yourself into the bath. Oh, clean up after yourself. What? To have leprosy? At the height of the itching, we had a visitor, a very important visitor. Oh, you will know him quite well. Another American intervened into my life. This one had to leave America in exile because he had just had a duel and shot someone rather important to you. And Alexander Hamilton, yes, he did not lift his gun. He shot him dead. Came over in exile. Uncle Aaron, we called him. Dear friends of my father. He would always escape with us up to that 5th floor. And I remember his arm around my shoulder on one particular hanging day. We liked him. We did little entertainments for him, speeches for him. Jane would sing songs and Fanny would make muffins and tea, and Charles would recite the speeches I wrote. Aaron Burr knew who wrote them. He sent all the children out of the room. Mary, why do you itch so? I am cursed. My skin is falling off like some vile serpent, Uncle Aaron. No, Mary. You itch because you were born for something greater. I see it in you. And so it was Uncle Aaron who talked to Father, and Father then talked to second mother, and she didn't like my flakes about the house anyway, so they decided that they should send me to one of their mutual political acquaintances, that I should be sent to the Scottish Highlands. And so I was just simply put on a boat, 14 years old. I was just put on a boat and set off. My father turned around there on the decks as the ship was pulling out from harbor, as if he suddenly remembered he was sending his 14-year-old daughter off into the world alone. He called out to the woman who was standing next to me, "Oh, that is my daughter. Will you see to her? Will you keep watch over?" "Oh, yes, sir. Yes, sir. I'll keep watch over your daughter. Don't you worry now." She kept watch over me until she found out where my wallet was kept, stole it, and disappeared. So I arrived penniless in Scotland. Fortunately, the political acquaintance of my father was a good man, William Baxter, and had 4 marvelous daughters. One daughter exactly my age, Isabella Baxter. Was she my first love? She was my height, and her hair was dark, and her eyes were dark where mine were blue, my hair red. The two of us together, running over the Scottish Highlands, bare feet, bare feet. Mary, you don't need shoes. No, what is a saddle? You don't need a saddle here. Just jump on the horse. Bare back, hair fine, barefoot. Life, and sun, and love. William Baxter loved his daughters. He let them run free. Soon my skin was well again, and the visit was over. They sent me back. The skin started to itch, sent me back to Scotland again. Twice I visited and stayed. On the second visit, a wondrous thing. Isabella was already in love. She was in love with her sister's husband. Margaret had died, and she wanted to marry the widow. She woke me up in the middle of the night. It's such a secret. She woke me up in the middle of the night, and she took me by horseback all the way to Dundee, to Guthrie Street. And there at the end of it, a hill. The hill was called the Law. It is a basalt hill, not too high. It was the hill on which they burnt the witches. And Isabella turned to me with moonlight flashing in her eyes. Mary, if we can get to the top of it, we can make a wish. And all those witches will listen, and they will bring our wish true if it is a good one. And so up she went to the hill, and then she stopped and she ran back down and she said, oh, but you must never have laid with a man. Have you ever laid with a man, Mary? Of course I'll have it. Oh, good, good, good. And up she went to the top of the hill and she made her wish, and I knew it. She wished she wanted to marry her sister Margaret's widow. She wanted to marry David Booth. She came down smiling. And I went up to the top of the hill, and you know what I wished for. I wished to make my mother proud. Are you watching me, Mother? I could feel her hand on my shoulder. Are the witches with you too, Mother? I could see them standing round. I knew that I was not mad, but words made pictures. Did I not watch my Uncle Samuel make pictures and shadows out of words on the wall? I'm going to ask 2 wishes, Mother. I want to make you proud, and I want to have a love as deep as yours and Father's. I want a true, forever love, Mother. They came down the hill. Isabella was married to David Booth, even though the church argued completely against it. Mr. Baxter protected his daughter's right to love. And of course, David Booth did love her too. And so they left the church. They did not mind if they were excommunicated. Love was law. And I knew that my father would grant me no less than that, hadn't I read everything my father and my mother had written. And so I went home, and little did I know that my love was already there. Here is the second poet in our story, Percy Bysshe Shelley, with a face of a fresh angel and a spirit too wild to be contained. He had come to study with my father while I was off in Scotland, and he was giving my father a good allowance. He was, in fact, quite rich. He was the grandson of a lord, of a Sir Timothy. But he was excommunicated from the family, if that is a word, exiled from the family for his wild thoughts and ideas. So he was living off his allowance, which was his grandfather's inheritance, which he was going to have to pay back 4 times the interest, but he didn't care. He was giving that money to my father for his political justice and his ideas. And then, of course, I came home, and then, of course, we sat across from each other at table. And then, of course, Percy Bysshe Shelley asked me to complete my thoughts. Oh, you don't understand. You live in a world where you have complete thoughts spoken out loud at a dinner table. Can you understand what that was? With second mama there at table, and my father watching as Percy asked me to complete my thoughts, loved my thoughts, added to them, both of us weaving with words across the table an affinity that would last for my entire life and after. Well, of course, my father would say yes and understand, wouldn't he? Oh, of course he would. Jane was the go-between, the little notes as we fell in love. There was a little matter of a previous marriage that Percy was attempting to get himself out of to Harriet. There was a child, but he could provide for her with the allowance, but he wanted a divorce kindly. Harriet had been married to him, an arranged marriage. There was no love, no feeling of heart. But she fought him on it. What rights did she have? Percy's family, the men of his family, were on Harriet's side. So, when Percy and I announced our love to my father, Percy said that as soon as his marriage with Harriet was resolved, then we would be married, and we waited for my father's ecstatic blessing. He screamed, sent him out of the house, chased him out of the house. No, chased me up to my room. It was violent as any fairy tale, as any folk tale. Harsh as Bluebeard. Up there I was, locked like Rapunzel, up on the 5th story, and Percy came, of course, with gun and laudanum, like Romeo and Juliet up the stairs. There is no point to life if we cannot love. But it was rather dramatic. And then he gave me a copy of his first poem, Queen Mab. Well, what was there to do but elope? Which we did. Now, we did not elope alone. That was not the point. We needed to save Fanny and Jane, too, from this world that didn't understand the equality of women and men. But Fanny refused to go. Jane came along. She packed up her things. It was 2 a.m. We snuck down those stairs. Percy was waiting in a carriage and climbed in the carriage. And then I realized that I had to say goodbye to my mother. So I turned around and I came back in quietly to that study and asked her for her blessing, and wrote a note to my father asking him to remember who he was, not who he had become. Oh, here now, the whole rest of the tawdry tale. There is much to read about it, and we are almost there, almost there. The world did not accept this Percy Bysshe Shelley with these 2 women on either sides, young women. We were 17 years old. Was he married to either of us? No one understood the arrangement. From that carriage, we went by boat all the way to Dover, from Dover all the way across to Calais. There we stayed at the Dessin, the nicest tourist hotel there as you enter into France. From there, we went to Paris. Paris did not know what to do with us either. It had just come through a revolution. Percy decided that we should go to Switzerland. Yes, the Swiss understand liberty and are truly profound people. How did he know this? Because of my father's writings. We read my mother's writings as we went along. Percy decided it'd be best if we walked. Was it because he would get no funds? He was running out of his allowance, or Harriet was being supported by the men of the family? We don't know. He had little funds. So he went with Jane and they came back with a donkey. We put our belongings on the donkey and we walked across the French countryside. The French countryside, which we had seen in paintings and had read about, especially from my mother's writings and my father's writings too. Pastoral and beautiful and full of soul and poetry it was after the revolution. The spring, after the winter, when the bodies had not been retrieved from the battlegrounds. And the countryside was starving, and the people were terrified and cowed and suspicious. With our donkey, Percy, and 2 women. Finally, the donkey tripped in a hole and sprained itself, and so Percy traded the donkey for a mule, and then Percy tripped and sprained his ankle. And so now Percy went on the mule. What a picture was there. And I, like my mother, 17, out from family, full of shadows, now able to write down my full thoughts and my feelings and the place, the trinity of language, thought, feeling, place. I wrote the entire journey down. And when we arrived to Switzerland, it wasn't pastoral and wonderful either. And I was homesick and we wanted to go home. And so we did. We decided that we would go along by the way of Holland. And just as we came around at Gernsheim, you know where I'm going, don't you? What is that? I asked one of the boatmen. That there? There's the Castle Frankenstein. The what? There's the Castle Frankenstein. What is that? I pulled out my paper. Oh, that's you never heard of Dr. Conrad Dipple? No, I've never heard of Conrad Dipple. Well, let me tipple a bit before I tell you. He threw back some warm, offered it to me. I did not take it. Percy did, and told us the story of Dr. Conrad Dipple, who used to go to the graves and would pull out the fresh bodies and bring them home. And then he would take his own blood and he would take it and mix it in with ground bones. And then he would introduce that into the corpse's mouth, hoping for immortality. And I was full with child and nauseous. We shall skip quickly ahead, for there are many deaths here. First, you must know we were not welcomed home by my father at all, and that Percy could not get any funds, and he did battle in court and got himself freed from Harriet, and we were at last able to marry, but not before I lost that child. My first, born alone without a doctor. 10 days. She died in my sleep. I held her in my arms. In that dark, shambled room so far from home, still unable to digest my adventures. My sister Fanny, she had gone and taken some laudanum herself, departed this land and joined my mother in the other. And Harriet, Percy's now former wife, got herself mixed up with a darker man and threw herself into the River Fleet. Every corner, every turn was Bluebeard or Mr. Fox, the only great being through it all, like a lantern, was Percy. Well, Jane decided that she wanted to have a love of her own. She decided she wanted to have a name of her own, so she took the name Claire. Claremont declared herself free of all former ideas, decided to be equal, went to the theater and eyed our third poet there in the box seats. Well, everyone knew this poet. This poet was a celebrity, yes, like your Elton John, yes. Everywhere he went, every nun knew it was Lord Byron. When Lord Byron wrote a poem, 10,000 copies would go out in the morning and be gone by the next day. Lord Byron had 5 dogs and 3 cats and 6 monkeys and an eagle and a falcon, a tamed bear. All this menagerie went with him wherever he went in his great carriage that he had modeled after Napoleon's military blue with its flaming lanterns on all its sides. Lord Byron decided that he would have a night with a lovely and titillating Claremont. And then she got up with child, and for him it was just one night. Oh, Mother, please vindicate the rights of women. I was then delivered of another child, a healthy child. We had an allowance now, a goodly amount. We lived in a simple house on Margaret Street. Percy and I would go sail little paper boats and set them afire and watch them burn. And Claire wanted Lord Byron to father the child. A volcano exploded in Indonesia. 1816, they call it the year without a sun. There was red snow in Italy. The corn froze. There was drought as far away as your New York City. What sun was there that year? Claire discovered that Lord Byron would be vacationing in Switzerland at a such and certain time, and managed by letter. And Lord Byron, you do know that my sister is Mary Wollstonecraft and William Godwin's daughter. You know Mary Godwin Shelley. Oh, she's married to that Shelley chap. He's a good enough poet. Yes. And we were going to go to Switzerland. I'll be going at that same time. Well, we shall all go together. And so we all went together. And Lord Byron brought his tag-along, his menagerie of animals, and always a friend. Dr. John Polidori was in tow. Dr. John Polidori was a very clever man and a good man, and he was hired. He was hired like a paparazzi and sent his notes every night to his publisher, reporting on Lord Byron's whereabouts and activities. Dr. John Polidori decided that he was in love with me. Everyone was always falling in love with everyone else except for me. Lord Byron had taught him that at the Villa Diodati, which we were renting, that if he would jump off the railing like a man and present himself to me, I might be moved to take him into my bed. He jumped off the railing of the Villa Diodati and sprained his ankle. Now we have donkeys and mules and doctors. I carried him up the steps while he professed his love, and I told him in no uncertain terms, there is only one man I have ever loved, will ever live, and will you stop? And there was no sun. There were storms, ever storms, and there we were, animals pacing, 4 legs and 2 legs, we inside in the great salon. We had just finished a book of ghost stories, and Lord Byron had pronounced them dreadful and thrown the book across the room, sat up in his chair. Can you see him with his hair wild and his shirt open and the firelight flaming in his face? Claire sitting up on the couch just to drink in his beauty. John Polidori there on the couch bemoaning his ankle and his broken heart. He said, well, you know, we could write about galvanism. What galvanism? You know, they're putting electricity in frog legs. Oh, tell us about that. He told us all about how they were putting electricity in frog legs in the theater. What is life? What is afterlife? What is the veil between these worlds? Where is my mother? Where are my dead children? Lord Byron said, we shall have a contest. Looked straight over at my husband, Percy, of course, and at Polidori. Of course, men would have contests. But Lord Byron decided it might be fun to include the women, well, at least the one. Let's see what Mary Shelley might do. She's come from good writer parents, perhaps. She could be in the contest, too. How is it that a girl could write such a thing? Well, John Polidori's story was about vampires. It had never been done in this way before. I believe there was a certain gentleman, a Mr. Bram Stoker, who got a hold of that and produced a much larger novel from it called Dracula. Yes, and Lord Byron's story, you could write it yourself. Let's see, what kind of story would Lord Byron write? Oh, he wrote about a very beautiful woman who seduced men into the woods, and when they were there safe in their clutches in the woods, they would turn into monstrous hags. Well, there was a lightning stroke just as Lord Byron reached that point in his story. And he was so electrified by shadow and firelight that my own Percy passed out. He was a very, very sensitive soul. You think that I am sensitive? Well, peel me of all my skin and make my heart 16 times larger. That was Percy. Just fainted. We brought him to with salts. I drained it. My monster. He was always called Creature. Frankenstein, the creator. Dr. Conrad Dipple, galvanism, bodies rotting on the Paris countryside. Second mother, shadows, Bluebeard, Mr. Fox. I saw it, a student leaning over something there. Here it is. Oh, we have to write it all by hand, you know. letter by letter, word by perfect word. Thank you, Father. It was on a dreary night of November that I beheld the accomplishment of my toils. With an anxiety that almost amounted to agony, I collected the instruments of life around me that I might infuse a spark of being into the lifeless thing that lay at my feet. It was already 1 a.m. The rain pattered dismally against the panes, and my candle was nearly burnt out. When, by the glimmer of the half-extinguished light, I saw the dull yellow eye of the creature open. It breathed hard, and a convulsive motion agitated his limbs. Love and Frankenstein. Thank you for coming with me into and through the dark. I would be very happy to answer questions if you have any.
Thank you so much. I'm going to drop Megan's website into the chat box where you can also put any questions if you have them. I'm monitoring the chat on YouTube and on Zoom, so if you have questions, please feel free to put them in either place. I know that on YouTube we have a little bit of a delay, and I know it always takes a little bit to type a question out. So if you have them, please drop them in there, and then I can ask them aloud. I had no idea that Mary Shelley knew Aaron Burr. That was something new for me.
I loved finding all the connections in her story. She had quite an amazing confluence of influences. She lived till she was 54 and died of a brain tumor at 54. Her last child lived, and so she was able to live working as a writer with her son, and when her son married, the daughter-in-law took kindly to her. And so she had a good life.
Okay. We've got a comment. Good job, enjoyed it.
Thank you. She lost Percy when she was 25 years old. They only had those 5-6 years together. Percy went off on a sailboat. Lord Byron and Percy got into contest about who could build the biggest boat. And so Percy's boat went over in a storm and he drowned. I'm just trying to anticipate what some questions.
Definitely. I have a question about how you research and kind of put together the whole story. Can you tell us a little bit about the process?
Yes, the best book, I was looking for it earlier so I could hold it up, but I couldn't put my hands on it. It's called Romantic Outlaws. And right at the moment, the author escapes me, but it is Romantic Outlaws. And it does the story of the mother and the story of Mary Shelley side by side. And it was a big, fat, fabulous book. So I'm just a book nerd. So I just read everything. And then I try to make sure that there's an arc. So it's not just facts.
Definitely. We do have a question that came in. How hard was it for her to convince that the story was hers and not Percy's to editors?
It took some time. It did take some time. She, of course, is completely acquitted now because of the research that's been done. When it was first published, it was published anonymously and it got very good reviews. And then the moment finally they had courage to the publisher to admit that it was by a woman, then the reviews retracted. Oh, what were we thinking? We were wrong. We were looking at this wrong. And but it's really a fascinating novel because she is also an inventor, not just of science fiction, but all novels previous to this, the male hero, by ambition, wins the day, the wife, the society, the beautiful children, and happily ever after. And Mary Shelley's novel was the first novel that turned that upside down and said, over ambition from the masculine can destroy everything that it loves. So she was asking a hard question of society.
I did drop a link to Romantic Outlaws. It is available in our
good.
section, so if you'd like to check that out, please feel free to check out that link and you can place it on hold.
Is that
Or
Charlotte?
use audiobook or ebook as well.
Yeah.
Our next question is, who made your costume?
Oh, I was so amazed. I found this on Etsy.
Wow.
Sarista, Sarista, finds and collects, original. This is an original gown. She doesn't make them. She finds them and then she sells them. So there it was on Etsy. I was trying to find an Edwardian gown and that's the one. Will it fit me? And it did. So Etsy.com. Yeah.
All right. I don't know that we have any more questions, but I am going to give it another minute or so, just in case people are typing. I know that's the hard part about doing things digital. Here we go.
Father did eventually forgive her. Once they were married, he became a little more open-minded, which is so ironic given who he was.
Yeah, definitely. Was the darkness understood to be from the volcano, or did people think the world was ending?
Oh, that's a terrific question. I would imagine that both were going on. I'm sure both points of view were coexisting. There isn't much writing that I found on Mary's opinion about the volcano because, of course, she was so enmeshed in this whole drama with her half-sister and Byron and babies and Percy. So I think for Mary, it was probably just an appropriate expression of her mood.
Lots of love and lots of loss in her story.
Yeah, yes.
Another minute or so, but thank you so much, Megan. We really enjoyed this. We do want to, Megan, if you'd like to tell them a little bit about what you have coming up, because you were telling me about it before we started and it sounded so fascinating.
I'm going to be performing Dracula the Novel, Bram Stoker's novel, inspired by Dr. John Polidori in this story. So I perform an adapted version of the novel, sticking true to the novel because, Hollywood made a mess out of it. And so that'll be on Zoom on Halloween at 6 p.m. So if you would like to come to that, send me an email, megan@meganwells.com, and I'll send you the URL for that. So Dracula, Halloween, 6 p.m.
Megan, we've got one more question that came in while we were talking. The dead bodies from the revolution became fodder for the creature. Is that?
I think if you look at it like a stew, right? It's all really a stew. I think I think that's a very influential image for her at 17, eloping from everything she knows. The fear of the farmers, that's you can read in the Frankenstein novel, the Frankenstein castle, Conrad Dipple, the storms, Lord Byron, right? Samuel Taylor Coleridge with his shadows on the wall. It's really, I think, a stew that just adds up. So at 19, being challenged, it just literally just pours out of her. It took her 2 years to get it all done, of course, because we're working in pen and ink. Right. And everything you revise, you scratch out and rewrite. Oh, then you got to rewrite the whole page. Very slow and painstaking work.
Definitely. I couldn't agree with this next comment more. This was fabulous. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's
Great.
absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much for being with us. If you'd like to hear some more Halloween-esque stories, we do have another program coming up on Thursday, October 29th. So we hope you join us again to hear the tale of Orson Welles and War of the Worlds as told by Laura Keyes in a lecture. So please join us on Thursday. All right, take care everybody and have a wonderful evening.
I know.
Bye.